This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. For this week's cattle market update, we are joined by Iowa State University livestock economist Lee Schulz. He shares information from the latest cattle on feed report, the state of current profit margins and the variability caused by inputs, and news regarding the USDA's cattle contracts library pilot program. Also ahead, K-State wheat and forage specialist Romulo Lollato joins us to share an update on current soil conditions for planting wheat and management advice on how to navigate late planting this year. We end with K-State fisheries and aquatics specialist Joe Gerken. He joins us for this week's wildlife segment where he discusses unexpected fish in ponds. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are starting off this Monday's programming with our cattle market update. And joining us for that this week, we have with us Lee Schulz. He is a livestock economist out of Iowa State University. So, Lee, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. And I have to give you a birthday shout out because it's your birthday and you're working and visiting with us. So we appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I'm entering my last year of my 30s. So it's a big year, I guess, as they say.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, happy birthday, Lee. And once again, thanks for spending it with us here at Ag Today. But let's get into the market. So let's talk through futures, fed cattle, and feeder cattle.
Well, I think, we got to put this week into context. So my birthday's on September 30th. And any time we're, at the end of a month, I think there is a bit of settling up, certainly as we look at some of those contracts. We had the September feeder cattle contract come off the books. There's certainly some different trading behavior that finishes a month. So that's important to remember. Overall, we've seen cattle markets down. We kind of continued that bearish tone in the markets. When you look at feeder cattle, I think that certainly is a follow-through from what we've seen in the corn market this last week. Corn, especially on Friday, we had a rather bullish grain stocks report as it relates to corn. Stocks came in much larger than pre-report expectations. That shot up the corn market, shot down feeder cattle market. So, I think there is, we're looking at some of those fundamentals really hitting the market. We've seen rather large slaughter levels continue. And, I think that's shown that the supplies are relatively heavy right now. And so I think that's been a bit bearish on our markets.
Absolutely, yeah. And the cattle on feed report was released about a week ago at this point now, I guess. So anything significant that showed there?
Yeah, I think that report continued much of the same. We've seen numbers across the board were up compared to year-ago levels. When you look at the cattle on feed number as well as the marketing number, those are well within pre-report expectations. The number that I think surprised the market a bit was the placements number came in above year-ago levels. That was well above what the range was. And I think there it's, we're still figuring out and really still seeing the implications of drought, dry weather that has plagued much of the country. We've seen much lighter weights enter into feedlots. That was another sign when we looked at the cattle on feed report for August. We did see a big uptick in those lightweight placements, especially relative to the heavier weight placements. I think one positive that came out of that report, as I look at it, is those front-end supplies, so cattle on feed over 120 days, still remain larger than year-ago levels. But when you can look at August 1 compared to September 1, we're not as front-end loaded. And so I think we're working through those heavy cattle supplies as shown by, much larger slaughter levels that we have seen. So, I think that is a positive for the market going forward. A bit of trivia, one thing I noticed is if you look at daily cattle slaughter on September 7th, so that's a couple weeks ago, remember that we get actual slaughter day, it's about a 2-week lag. That slaughter on September 7th was 130,147, and that was the daily slaughter. That is the first time it topped 130,000 head since December 2013. Both of those were federal holiday weeks, so that was Labor Day as we look at that September 7th, Labor Day being that Monday prior. Why I note that is, these supplies of cattle remain relatively large, right, in the short term. And I think we're certainly seeing that weigh on the markets. The cattle on feed number does back that up. One more observation from the cattle on feed data. Here in Iowa, we actually have a 1,000 head plus cattle on feed report, and then a less than 1,000 head cattle on feed for capacity feedlots. And what I take away from there is those placement numbers in those large feedlots were up in Iowa, notably about 16% higher than year-ago levels. But when I look at those smaller feedlots, they were actually down 36% compared to year-ago levels. So I think when you look at that collectively, that shows that those placement numbers may be weighted towards the larger feedlots. Why that's important is, I think as we enter a typically large placement months here, as we get into September, October, there's a lot less interest, I think, from farmer feeders to maybe place cattle on feed. And part of the reason there is we have expensive corn. I can market that corn off the farm as corn, or I can market it as through my cattle. And here, it's a lot less risk just to market the corn off the farm. And so I think that's something to watch as we go forward of the interest from buyers, especially from those small farmer feeders, given what corn prices are.
Yeah, especially if those prices continue. I was talking with Dan O'Brien. He's our grain economist here at K-State, and he was saying we usually expect a dip in some of our grain markets right now as harvest is going on, but they've really held fairly strong or stayed sideways at this point, so that'll be interesting to see if that continues for sure. And then in terms of reports, I know we also had the USDA hogs and pigs report recently come out, and people are probably thinking, well, this is the cattle market report. Why are we talking about this? But it's a competing market nonetheless that I think you've mentioned it's important to cover as well.
Yes, and you're talking to an analyst that's sitting here in Iowa, right? So this is one report that I follow very intently as looking at the hogs and pigs, because it's important to Iowa producers because we produce such a large share of the hog production. But also, I think it certainly has implications when you look at the whole protein sector. Certainly, we're seeing supplies tighten in the pork market. That is pushing hog prices higher. It's pushing pork prices higher. And certainly, pork does compete in some respects with beef in that retail meat case. Also, I think it does foreshadow a bit when we look at what's to come in the cattle complex. So we've seen contraction in the pork industry really since 2020, and realizing that that's what's to come here in the cattle industry. So I've started this show talking about how large cattle supplies are, but we're going to start to see those supplies tighten as we get into the fourth quarter, as we get into 2023 and 2024. Projections are for very tightening of the cattle supplies and beef production. And so I think, as we look at the hogs and pigs numbers, we're relatively bullish. Numbers were below pre-report expectations. They were below year-ago levels. That certainly, I think, foreshadows what we're going to see here going forward as you look at the cattle complex.
You've been looking at a number of different things as economists do. Obviously, you guys track a lot of different margins and inputs and outputs, and something that's caught your eye recently is kind of the profitability margins that we're seeing in the industry right now. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I tracked profitability in both cattle and hogs rather intently, or try to do it rather precisely too. And when you look at estimating those margins, historically, you're really focusing in on the output price, be it cattle or hogs, and then the input prices. There's a lot of inputs that go into livestock production, but typically what's driving a lot of those margins are feed costs. And that's a lot of times why we look at ratios of like the hog to corn ratio or cattle to corn ratio, because over time that kind of gives a really good barometer of profitability. But really since 2020 we've seen tremendous hikes in a lot of those non-feed variable costs, and we've seen really inflationary pressure there, and that's certainly really eating at margins of producers. And so when you look at, for example, fuel prices being up 100% compared to year-ago levels, that really impacts certainly profitability for producers. You can even look at it from the standpoint of what impacts feeder cattle prices, right? And so increased corn prices or increased diesel fuel prices certainly impact the price I'm able to pay for feeder cattle. And so that's why I think it's really important to track those prices or indices over time. Also, when you think about a lot of those non-feed variable costs, there isn't an opportunity to mitigate that risk like there is for feed costs. So feed, you have the ability to forward contract or hedge some of that risk. But when it comes to labor or fuel or things like that, it may be a little bit more difficult for producers to do that. So I think it's important, again, to track those over time. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So I think USDA does a really good job of helping us measure a lot of those input costs.
Absolutely, yeah. And you wrote an article about that you shared recently. So that will be shared in the show notes of today's program as well on agtoday.net if you guys are tuning in and interested in hearing more about Lee's take on that. But there's something else that you wanted to highlight today just quickly here, Lee, and it's the USDA Cattle Contracts Library Pilot Program. A mouthful there. But tell us a little bit about that.
So many of our listeners will probably remember it if we go back as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. Remember that USDA's Agriculture Marketing Service was directed to create a cattle contracts library. They had a listening session back in April 2022 that began the process of gathering feedback. And through that, they've developed a model that will allow for this information to be presented to the public. How they populated that model was they took a lot of inactive contracts so they could get a working model. They shared that information with a lot of stakeholders, gathered more feedback. Now they're at the phase that they want to populate this cattle contract library pilot with active contracts. So there's some rulemaking that needs to be done to be able to collect that information, then collecting the information, putting it into the program that they have, and then put it public facing. So I think this latest update from USDA is important to understand that they've worked tremendously hard to get this information available, and soon it will become available once they go through the requisite steps to get this properly acquired, the information, then present it to producers and users or people interested in this information.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be a super beneficial tool to know about once it's ready to roll out and be used. But Lee, as always, we thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Lee Schulz. He is a livestock economist joining us from Iowa State University for this week's cattle market update. We will be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with K-State wheat and forage specialist Romulo Lollato. He is joining us to talk about current wheat planting conditions. And Romulo, as I'm talking to you, we're over Zoom right now. You're in the field planting yourself.
Hi, Samantha. Good morning. Yes, definitely. So this has been a busy week for us. We started the week out in Wichita County by Leota, planting some of our trials in that west central part of the state. We moved all over the state this week. So we planted near Hoisington, near Hayes, Phillipsburg, and now we are in Belleville. So we are making the rounds and trying to get some of our trials in the ground as well to take advantage of some of the moisture that we had last week.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. I know you've clearly been very, very busy, but we really do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So, like you mentioned, drought conditions from a couple weeks ago compared to now, pretty different, right, in terms of topsoil moisture?
Absolutely. So a couple of weeks ago, we were concerned and putting out some recommendations for growers on what do they do if it's wheat planting time and things are bone dry. And that was the concern a couple of weeks ago. We really didn't have any moisture in the topsoil in most of the state and most of the subsoil as well because we have had such a dry summer. So we were putting out some considerations on what to do and how to manage the crop under those conditions. But last week, things turned a little bit better there in terms of having moisture in a great part of the state, especially central, northwest Kansas. I think we're more blessed than south central and southwest. But parts of the state there also got some rain. So really, statewide, we were lucky to get some precipitation and improved planting conditions here in the last week.
Last I checked, every single county across the state from a little over a week ago, that wave of precipitation that we got. So I know everybody's soil conditions weren't perfect per se, but at least improved somewhat.
Yes. And you know, for the most part, the moisture that we got, as you mentioned, throughout the state should be enough to at least get the crop emerging. So during this time of the year, the wheat doesn't need a whole lot of water really for it to emerge. It just needs to absorb some water in the seed and start that emergence process. And during the fall, it doesn't require a lot of water, again, unless it's wheat for grazing, right? Unless we're looking into a dual-purpose system where we want biomass. So that little bit of moisture that we got, and parts of the state wasn't too little, right? North Central, we got up to 3 inches in parts of the state there. So that should be more than enough for a very nice start of the crop. Where we got perhaps less than an inch, that's going to be borderline conditions. And if growers are able to plant, still taking advantage of that moisture, they should be able to get a good stand. But it is important to remember that we will need more moisture, especially to make a nice root development to go into the winter and ensure that we have some good winter hardness and good crop development before the winter. But absolutely, the planting conditions improved considerably. We are seeing many drills out, so growers are definitely taking advantage of that moisture. We are also seeing that growers are busy harvesting summer crops, right? And so a lot of soybeans that look ready and a lot of combines rolling on those soybeans as well. I've seen fields that got already harvested from soybeans and are already being planted to wheat as well. So overall, very promising, this rainfall that we have had in the last week here.
You kind of hinted at this while you were speaking there, but dual-purpose wheat requires a bit more moisture than our typical wheat that we grow in Kansas does. So this season might not be a good option for dual-purpose wheat?
Well, that's a really good comment, Samantha. And let's think about that one a little bit, right? If we're just interested in the grain, we don't really need much biomass on that crop now in the fall, right? We're looking at maybe 3 to 5 tillers in terms of an optimum tiller growth going into the winter. And that doesn't require a lot of growth. Really less than 1,000 pounds of dry matter per acre should get us to those 3 to 5 tillers. So, the less biomass we have, the less moisture the crop is going to use. Now, for dual-purpose growers, it's going to be a little bit more challenging, right? First, because they're mostly in South Central and Southwest Kansas, parts of the state that didn't get as much rainfall as North Central and Northwest. So they will start with that limitation already, which is more. In that crop, we can get up to 3,000 or 3,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. The more biomass we have out there, the more water is going to be used by that crop through transpiration, so it needs more water. And so if conditions are dry, that can hurt the crop. And I'm hearing reports even from our neighbors down south in Oklahoma that many growers who are their operations are always dual purpose, they might not be able to get that done this year, mostly because they're not going to have the conditions to plant it on time now to get enough growth and enough biomass in the fall to justify that grazing. So I'm afraid that can extend a little bit north as well, depending on the subregion of the state that we're talking about and depending on how much rainfall we got and the forecast. It might not be a grazing year because of these very dry conditions that we are having. But still, the moisture that we got for the grain-only crop, I think that we're so far in a pretty decent shape. Of course, depending on the part of the state where we are, it might be a little bit too early to plant, so there is that consideration as well.
Absolutely. But as it stands right now, is there, a time that we should be looking at where it's too late to be planting this year, where we're waiting on more moisture and just waiting and waiting and waiting? Is there a cutoff date for us this year that we should know about?
Well, we actually looked at hundreds of thousands of yield data points from K-State over the years, and we tried to define the optimum planting dates for the state. And if we're looking at the Northwest, the last week of September is our prime. So right now, that's when growers need to be out and getting their wheat in the ground, and they have moisture to do so. About perfect scenario there for at least to get the crop emerged. As we go more towards the north central part of the state, we're looking more at October 5th or something along these lines in terms of our optimum in that Republic County region. And as we move south, it gets even later, right? October 10th, around that McPherson region or Salina region. And as we move south even more towards the Sumner County line, we're looking more at an October 15th in terms of our optimum planting date, right? We don't want to plant it too early. Again, there is a risk of the crop growing too much and using precious moisture that we needed later on. By planting too early, we also increase the risks associated with transmission of viral diseases. Wheat streak mosaic, we've been seeing a lot of that in central Kansas in recent years. Barley yellow dwarf, that's been a problem as well. So we don't want to plant too early to avoid some of those viral diseases that are more likely to be transmitted early in the fall now. So for growers in that south central part of the state, I'm still thinking that October 10th to October 15th is prime time, right? And that's kind of what I'd like to shoot for. Of course, growers in northwest part of the state, north central part of the state, if there's moisture, I'm probably recommending getting going and getting as much planted as possible at this time. Western Kansas in general, we try to plant when there's moisture. And so even if it is in more in the southwest part of the state and there's moisture available, that'll be my dictating factor there. And so I don't think it is too early that part of the state. It will be too early if it is early September, but late September, early October, if there's moisture available, absolutely, we should be going for that. So right now, caution that I would have would be, central, south central Kansas, maybe a little bit on the early side there. But if the forecast doesn't look promising, there's still consideration that growers can have and get going. I know many growers in the McPherson region are actually having their drills out and planting this week. I was just talking to our county agent there, and that's the report that he was giving us. And so some growers are just trying to take the opportunity and plant it while there's moisture.
Absolutely, yeah. I spoke to our meteorologist, Chip Redman, last week for our Friday weather update, and he mentioned that October's looking rather dry. So those that may be anticipating wanting to plant in those prime times, like you mentioned, the second, the third week of October, they might have to wait until the very end of October. Is that too late in terms of planting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what do we do if we get to that mid-October and the soil is dry, meaning we probably won't get a good emergence from our planting now, and there's really no rain in the forecast, right? Then the grower has a few options, right? Just to dust it in and wait for rain. That would probably be the recommendation there, right? Because it's already on the late side. Well, for South Central, it would be on the optimum, but it can get on the late side fairly quick, right? And so the recommendation would be to dust it in and kind of wait for rain. So I would treat my crop in that case as if I was planting late already. So what are some of the recommendations when we're planting late would be to increase your seeding rates, right? So instead of using that 1.2 million seeding rate, we bump up a good 10% per week that we're planting late. So if you don't expect rain the next couple of weeks, at least a good 20 to 30% higher population there could already be justified. Another recommendation that we have in those circumstances is in-furrow fertilizer. If you're able to put any in-furrow phosphorus fertilizer, that really helps out with early season crop development in wheat. And so that's another one of the recommendations that we have. It's just like trying to put 50, 60 units of diammonium phosphate or ammonium phosphate or something along those lines in furrow to just get that early crop started faster, right? Anything that we can help the crop. Third option in terms of management will be related to, variety selection, although at that point in time is late enough that I don't think growers would change their variety selection based on that. But if it is that the opportunity, try to look for some varieties that still tiller well in the spring and that they can make up for yield if they don't have those fall tillers. That'll be important. And varieties that have a good yield record when planted late, right? That'll be another recommendation as well. So if it gets to a point where we are mid-October and it is really dry and growers haven't planted yet, perhaps because they were waiting on harvesting a summer crop or they were waiting on that optimal planting date, right? That would likely be my recommendation. Let's go ahead and get it planted, get it dusted in, but as if it was already late October or early November. Just let's take those management steps to help our crop make the most out of it.
Well, Romulo, some great insight you just provided right there. I know producers tuning in will appreciate your words of wisdom. But once again, we just really thank you for your time. I know you're really busy, so we're going to let you get back to planting. But thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate it. And always good to visit with you.
Once again, that was Romulo Lollato. He is our K-State wheat and forage specialist on planting conditions for wheat and some management tips as well. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Malia Walker. We are concluding today's program with our weekly wildlife segment, and I'm here in studio today with Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. So, Joe, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat with you today.
We're going to talk about unexpected fish in ponds today. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So we all know that we stock fish into ponds. We have desired species that we want to have, but I've been getting a lot of calls and visits with clients throughout the state having species of fish that we just don't normally expect or encounter.
So unexpected fish are the fish that we didn't stock ourselves. What type of fish are people seeing? And if we didn't put them there, how did they get there?
Sure. So common examples of these fish would be like gizzard shad or long-nosed gar. And so fish that we normally see in streams or rivers, and they make their way into a pond. And so it seems like, how does that happen? Generally, what happens is during a high flow event, there's connectivity. Fish don't need a lot of water to be able to get from one area to another. So even like a muddy habitat, they can kind of wiggle their way from one habitat over to a pond. The other thing I see commonly are Good Samaritans, so buddies trying to help you out, and they caught a bunch of bluegill, and they're going to add those to your pond, but unfortunately they weren't really bluegill. So those are the two main ways that we get these fish into our ponds.
So how do we find these fish in our ponds?
So first thing you do, a lot of people, you want to be fishing probably. So if you're catching fish that don't look like most of the other fish, that's probably a good indication they're there. Doing a sample of your pond is the best way to know what's in your pond. So some electrofishing, putting electric current into the water, the fish float up to the top. That's really the best scientific way to do it. It also can get expensive. So just doing some fishing, throwing out some minnow traps, kind of seeing what you got. If you take pictures, you send them in to me or your local extension agent. We can help identify them and make sure your pond's happy and all the fish that are there are expected to be there.
So if we find an unexpected fish species in our pond through one of these methods, how do we determine if they need to be there or not?
Sure. So I would start with your local extension agent, but you can call anytime. We can help make sure the fish you have are the desired species, and that's important. We want to make sure the fish that we have benefits and not drawbacks from having them there.
So once we identify them, we can determine our next steps. What are some of the benefits to having some of these fish in our ponds?
Yeah, so it depends on what fish are there, but a lot of times they can provide benefits. So gizzard shad, for example, are a really common forage fish for largemouth bass. So they can help our bass grow faster and help them grow up. More often, though, we see concerns with having these fish in our ponds. Concerns would be those same gizzard shad I talk about that can help our bass grow up. They grow up too big, and then they can compete with small bass. They can make the recruitment or how many bass we're getting added to our pond drop down and drop out. So most of the time, if we don't want the fish or we don't know that they're in there, they're not being managed properly. So the concerns almost always outweigh the benefits of having some of these different species in our ponds.
Okay, so competition with our preferred fish, is that the primary concern when we're finding these different fish?
So competition can happen too. A lot of people think that's happening when they see fish like gar. Gar have gnarly teeth and they look really mean. Most of the research shows that gar are eating what we would call rough fish. So they're eating carp suckers, buffalo, carp. They're not really eating bass. But if we put them in a pond where all they have to eat are bass or bluegill, they're going to start to eat some of those fish that we want to have in our pond. So any fish that we don't put there, we'd want to make sure that we manage and get them out of our pond.
So how do we manage our pond? We're finding unexpected fish. How quickly do we need to restore equilibrium?
Ponds, to be properly managed, have to have the right amount of predators, which most of us want to catch, like bass, but they also need to have enough food for the bass. And so if we have unexpected species coming in, the balance of the right amount of forage fish, small fish, to bigger fish can quickly get disrupted. So it's not an emergency if you see an unexpected fish in your pond, but you definitely want to make sure that if you're starting to see those, we address it as quickly as we can. Ideally, we want to be able to address it before those fish reproduce and turn a small problem into a really big problem.
All right, Joe, if listeners have been finding unexpected fish or want to look into the possibility of finding unexpected fish in their ponds, where can they find resources to help with this?
As always, reach out to your local extension agent. They're a fabulous resource. Going to your pond, learning about the fish that are in your pond, spend some time down there catching some of those fish. All of our information is on our Wildlife Extension Specialist page. Come reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Well, thank you for joining us again today, Joe. Once again, that was Joe Gerken, Fisheries and Aquatic Extension Specialist, joining us for this week's Wildlife segment. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.